the nice thing of MLIPAudit is that you can actually use the benchmarks for doing your own applications. So you have a way to deploy the model and already do useful things for it, right? So for example, if you are minimizing molecules, well, we already wrote the code for you. So you can as well like install it and use it.
Hi everyone, welcome to Let's Talk Research, the official InstaDeep podcast where we dive into cutting-edge AI research and the stories behind it. My name is Bora Gilola and I'm a research scientist here at InstaDeep.
And I'm Massimo Bortone, I'm also a research scientist at InstaDeep. In today's episode, we will be revisiting Machine Learning Interatomic Potentials, or MLIPs for short. We will be looking at, in particular, how to benchmark and compare different MLIPs against each other and in the context of applications. For this, we will be talking about our own benchmarking framework, MLIPAudit.
Exactly, and joining us today for that discussion are two people who have worked very closely on this problem. We have staff research scientist Silvia Acosta Gutierrez and applied research scientist Leon Wehrhan. Welcome both.
Hi, happy to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So guys, before we talk about MLIPAudit and all the technical bits, let's learn a bit more about you. So how did you come to InstaDeep and what's your background?
Thanks, Massimo. So I studied physics. I studied computational and theoretical physics, and I did my PhD in physics, but I found out very quickly that I was actually interested in applied physics, and most especially to applied physics to biology. So for example, during my PhD, I was trying to figure out how molecules enter inside bacteria to kill them and design better antibiotics for antibiotic resistance. And then I did a few postdocs, actually quite a long time, in trying to understand different drug modalities. So from GPCRs, which are very trendy these days, thanks to the semaglutide, to drug delivery. So I joined InstaDeep actually as a molecular modeling expert. And then very quickly, I gravitated towards the research department and most importantly, MLIPs.
And how about you, Leon? How did you get to InstaDeep and what's your background?
I have a background in chemistry. In my undergrads, it was actually mostly lab chemistry, and then I made the move to computational chemistry. And I'm also very interested in applying all these methods of computational chemistry and also molecular simulation to problems in the space of medicinal chemistry, of drug discovery, of chemistry in general. So for example, I was researching protein dynamics and binding pockets of proteins in my master's and also doctors. And I was specifically looking at like how these pockets or the properties of these proteins behave when you introduce certain elements, for example, fluorine into them, and specifically looking at like how water goes in and out of these pockets. And it's a very dynamic process. And that's how I came to this field. And I started at InstaDeep in Silvia's team. So in the applied research team here at InstaDeep. And the MLIPs actually fit in very well in these research interests because they're such powerful tools in the field of computational chemistry and fit in really great.
So just to recap a little bit, with an MLIP, obviously we've had a previous episode where we really dove into the details there, but the idea is always kind of, we want to have some way of understanding what a macroscopic property is caused by, right? So a macroscopic property in this case could be anything, right? It's some observable, usually experimental, could even be a color change in a test tube. But normally what we're after is really a mechanistic kind of understanding of why that thing is happening and why we're observing what we're observing. And at the very core of it, right, it's going to be bonds breaking, bonds being made, things rearranging themselves, kind of conformations of proteins, so on and so forth. So there, obviously, the molecular kind of modeling field really shines, right, because we can just, shine a light into this. But that is also a relatively mature field, right? So we've had kind of molecular dynamics and molecular simulation be very fruitful areas for years and years now. But more recently, we have had kind of an explosion in the MLIP area. I just wanted to get your thoughts on kind of what MLIPs bring that we didn't necessarily have with classical force fields.
Right. So, as you said, right, when molecular simulation and molecular modeling is all about trying to have a virtual microscope in a real-time experiment, right? So this change of color maybe is a reaction. So two molecules come together and then you form a different type of molecule. So we can actually do that in a computer. We couldn't do it classically because classical force fields are a mathematical function, and therefore you cannot actually, let's say your bonds are fixed. If two atoms are connected, they stay connected throughout the simulation, and that is not going to change. So you will need to use a quantum mechanical tool, for example, density functional theory, DFT. And then in that case, you do an ab initio simulation and you could see the atoms forming and breaking, let's say. But it's very density functional theory or any other type of quantum mechanical methods are very slow and very compute intense, let's say. So you could not simulate long enough or enough cases, let's say. While MLIP is a DFT surrogate, you can think about it like that. So you can do this job in a fraction of a second, for example. And that enables screening, and that enables let's say the practitioner or the person that is doing the experiments to be able to examine many different cases, right? And in that case is a really powerful technology that is going to make a huge impact, and I think it's already making an impact on discovery for materials, for biomolecules, anything, really.
Mm-hmm. Right, and you mentioned DFT, and I think DFT is a really good analogy for MLIPs as well, in the sense that there are many DFT functionals. There's not, I mean, we would like to have a universal DFT functional, but there isn't. And in a similar way, we don't have a universal MLIP, although people are trying to build one. So at the moment, there are many different MLIPs, and certain MLIPs work well for some applications, some work well for others. So how does MLIPAudit fit into this picture?
So MLIPAudit is a public and standardized suite of benchmarks. And we separate the benchmarks by different fields of application. We have small molecule benchmarks, we have biomolecular benchmarks, we have benchmarks focused on bulk materials. And MLIPAudit enables developers and users of MLIPs to evaluate their MLIPs on different tasks within this field. And these tasks are focused at applications that they may have in mind. And it's very easy using MLIPAudit to evaluate different types of MLIPs on the same benchmarks. So you can compare them and see how they perform in the task you want to be able to solve.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but this whole field has seen a massive development and implosion, essentially, of new ways of treating molecular simulation. What do you think is the most exciting developments in the last years in MLIPs? And
I think the most exciting thing in MLIPs is really that they are so applicable to chemical reactions, because that's something you essentially cannot do with a classical force field. It's just hard coding the bonds, and it's not really applicable to bond breaking. There are some methods to do it with classical force fields, but the MLIPs really do it so much more accurately. Of course, you do have the DFT methods, but as Silvia has said, they are very slow, and you really unlock new applications when you use MLIPs, because they're just applicable to so much bigger systems and so much more time frames, more inference calls.
And when we discuss MLIPs, right, obviously we're talking about ML here. So there's always the problem of what you can apply these things to, right? Like what is actually covered in your training distribution so that you can generalize to to your system of interest. And obviously in that vein, there's a lot of research going on in terms of what you train on, how you train, the different architectures that you can use, and so on and so forth. And there's really been this kind of big explosion in the diversity of machine learned force fields, essentially, that have come out in recent years. How do we normally go about kind of picking and choosing which one? Right, in the classical sense, we would just say, okay, we have a protein, let's go with amber, let's go with this force field. But obviously with MLIPs, there's a little bit more evaluation to be done before we can actually choose what we're going to simulate with.
It's very important. You have to evaluate the MLIP on different things. Mm-hmm. But once, of course, you want them to be accurate. And this is something that a lot of machine learning researchers evaluate if your MLIP is accurate. But there's more if you're actually interested in applying it to something useful, to a real world problem, so to say. And that is if it's really reliable. So, for example, is it able to run a simulation stable? Or is it scalable to the kinds of systems you want to model? And these are sometimes really hard questions to answer.
Yeah, it feels a lot like we were having this discussion when we were discussing generative models, right? There's so many different things that you can test that it's almost impossible to cover all your bases. So do you go about kind of prioritizing different things and picking out essentially what you want to show to demonstrate that an MLIP is actually doing what you want it to do?
I think it comes the expertise, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is why we have in our team pure AI researchers, and then it comes our application team, right? Because as you said before, so first is the data that you are training on. So if in this case we use DFT data, which is another computational methods, and it has other approximations. So for example, if the physics that your ground truth data is incorrect because your DFT is not good enough for that type of system, then your MLIP is not going to be able to do a good job, right? Mm-hmm. So the work for the practitioner starts there. Like, where was this architecture trained in the data that can represent the physics that I want to see in my experiment? Because we have a physics surrogate, right? Like, we are making the experiment. And then one very important thing is that obviously for ML researchers, they want to make a huge model, right? And I want to take all the data in the world, millions of data points and so on, because I wanted to generalize and so on, which is amazing. But then it might not be good for an application. There is a fine line in which you need to learn how to decide. And what I realize is that most of this knowledge is with the practitioner, no? With the person that is actually doing the drug discovery, that it doesn't have per se to have a knowledge, mm-hmm. a very deep technical knowledge of the MLIP. But they have the knowledge about DFT for sure, like computational chemists. They know all these classical tools. So this is how we came up with our framework. These were like the users we had in mind at the beginning, but then, well, it exploded. It kept evolving because it's also very useful for, let's say, the person that is designing the architecture or training the model to actually go beyond static metrics, right? That is where normally classical papers about MLIPs focus on. Like, mm-hmm. It's my energy that I am training on good enough. Have I learned the forces, validation, train, etc. But yeah, I think MLIPs are special because you train in a setup, let's say, and then you deploy in a very different one.
Yeah.
And it's in that case, there was a gap that needed to be bridged. And that's the soul of MLIPAudit, let's say.
So you notice this gap between how usual machine learning practitioners benchmark models by just looking at one metric. And you said that's definitely not enough because this is a different scenario here altogether.
Exactly. Like, you might take your MLIP might perform perfectly, energies, forces, etc. And then you try to run a simulation and it completely blows up. And it's like, okay, what happened here? Like, and it goes beyond that because you might not have an explosion, but then we're doing statistical physics, right? So we need to collect the properties, and we need to do ensembles like averages, and these averages need to be correct and similar to the experiment, which is our ultimate ground truth, right? And so if your description is not good enough, then you are generating basically numbers that will lead you to the wrong experimental surrogate, let's say. And therefore it's not good fit for purpose, let's say.
Right. So how did you go about pulling together all these different tests in MLIPAudit? If I remember correctly, you did that amount of work in a really short time. And I think it was quite stressful overall for the team. I wasn't part of the effort, but I think a lot of people were under a lot of pressure. But yes, so talk us through the story of.
We were thinking first, like what would you want to be able to do with an MLIP? For example, you wanted to be able to run a biomolecular simulation of a small protein, for example, and maybe you even wanted to be solvated. And this already is a quite challenging system for an MLIP because it gets you a quite big system and it needs to run stable. So we made a benchmark that assesses if this is stable and also if it samples the correct conformations you want to see. This would also be a benchmark in this. If you're interested in the small molecule field, you might be interested if your MLIP passes a benchmark, if it can predict barrier heights of reactions, or if it runs stable a simulation where you are interested essentially in finding a transition state if that runs stable, or just an energy minimization. Or maybe you wanted to use to parameterize something, a different force field or something, and you needed to produce very accurate parameters that fit observations from quantum mechanical calculations and experimental observables. And coming from these applications in mind, we were designing this suite of benchmarks where you can look at every benchmark and see, okay, how does my model perform on this and this and this task? So it's not just a leaderboard where you have one score and you see, okay, my model is the best in overall score, but you can also look deeper into it and then have a true understanding of what your model can do and what it cannot do.
So it's really kind of trying to capture the breadth of applications, but also just not really picking the one winner, right? We acknowledge the fact that different MLIPs will try and achieve different things and different teams will be interested in different tasks. And so we break this all apart and essentially just pick and choose to see whether you can perform on the task that you're actually interested in solving.
So you might have, as I said, a very big model that has seen all the data, right? And the real ambition is to learn this foundational model that has understood all of chemistry, right? So this model eventually will perform well in all categories, but it's going to be huge. So then you will be able to run only very small systems. If I want to run a protein, it's not going to fit in the memory of the GPU. Like this is like the hardware is going to start to be actually a problem when we want to scale these, let's say, these calculations more and more. So, but you might as well not need it, right? You can train a tiny model on very good data that performs very well for your task. And so I think it was important for us to give let's say, the user some sort of flexibility in the matching models with what you actually want to do. Like I think I'm not a fan of something that fits everything because we're not yet there, I think. So we need to be smart at this point in time on how we deploy MLIPs. But it's been like very interesting also to your question. Like we found a lot of edge cases, this is the good thing of MLIPAudit. And we came up with a lot of innovations that then we bring back into the drawing board and say, hey, look, the MLIP is not really understanding when a molecule is charged or things like that. Or I am missing here because they are very good. They are learning quantum mechanical information, but it's a machine learning model at the end of the day. So it's doing interpolations. And you have also issues because so they learn data in equilibrium, but to make a reaction, you need to go from equilibrium, you go out of equilibrium, and then you will have your products in equilibrium again. If your model doesn't know anything about the physics, out of equilibrium physics, it's gonna blow. Because let's say there are no parameters, like it doesn't know how to interpolate this new conformation, let's say, of your nodes and your edges. And this has been very, very interesting for us to actually innovate in the space too.
What has been the reception of MLIPAudit so far in the wider community?
Well, I follow the statistics. I think it's been very, very good. We were invited to Europe's, to one of the workshops, and people really, really like the idea, because it's very painful to actually put as you said, it was a tour de force to put MLIPAudit together from the design perspective, but also from the engineering perspective, right? Like I think Christophe has been here before talking about the libraries. Like MLIPAudit is only possible because we had the MLIP library, right?
Yep.
To deploy these models. And it's, I think it was it's very well engineered. It's modular, right? So the community, you can write your own benchmark. And for example, if you have your own model, you can send it to us if you don't have the compute, or you can run it yourself, and then you can send, for example, your numbers to update the leaderboard. But I think the nice thing of MLIPAudit is that you can actually use the benchmarks for doing your own applications. So you have a way to deploy the model and already do useful things for it, right? So for example, if you are minimizing molecules, well, we already wrote the code for you. So you can as well like install it and use it.
Yeah, so the idea from the beginning was to open source this code and have it available to the wider community. Because in general, that's not given that a leaderboard like this is like open to everyone. Often they hide the private benchmark, and then you have to submit your model. They run it, and then it's being scored, but it's all behind doors. I think this is quite a different tool in that sense.
I think the community really appreciates that point, and also that it's standardized away, and you could train or test every model you want on this framework. And this provides really like a platform for a standardized benchmark for all the models you would train yourself, or maybe you could even train some models you're interested in that are also publicly available. And this is really a problem otherwise for researchers if you're interested in, okay, I want to use an MLIP for an application, and you may look at some papers and you see some scores being reported, and they're all amazing and reporting amazing scores, and you would really like to use all of them, but can you actually trust them? Like, are they really comparable? And this is really a problem. And I think this open source mindset we put into MLIPAudit really helped with making such a standardized way where you can really say, okay, we have the same benchmark, exact same benchmark, and we test different models on this exact benchmark, and we see how they perform.
Have you had any surprising results or findings so far?
I mean, we did have some surprises, especially in the simulation stability. I think that's especially one that's very hard to predict from energy and force metrics. And in general, you would think, okay, if you have a model that can predict potential energies and force as well, it must do very well in simulations, because that's essentially what it needs to do to run a simulation, right? But the problem is actually very complicated, because the model, when it runs a simulation, is exploring a very broad region, or at least like very, very many conformations in this phase space that the molecule has. And it needs to be very accurate in all of them. If it has not seen like one, or it cannot extrapolate to a specific conformation or so, it might be completely off in the potential energy, or predict a force that's completely wrong, aggressively drive the model towards states it should not. And this can easily crash a simulation very easily and fast. And so yeah, it's not really a predictable property, and this is definitely where we had some surprises.
Another thing, it's biomolecular simulations are extremely complicated. Just because just because of the size, it's very complicated to sample long enough to actually, and this was a criticism, it's our biomolecular benchmark models are not so well ranked. Like they score more or less the same. They don't score perfectly, but let's say an average 6/10. We can say it like that. And it's simply because it's so expensive to run the simulation that we cannot sample enough to actually start to see the differences in between these models. So that calls for innovation, right? Like we really, well, either we are gifted some huge GPUs, or we really need smaller models that can understand the chemistry that is needed for biomolecular simulations, and that is going to be very important to keep, let's say, moving the needle in this field.
But that is also exactly why you kind of originally came up with the idea of MLIPAudit, right? To find these kind of gaps in the applications and to be able to assess them and say, okay, look, no one's doing well here, everyone's doing pretty well here, or here there's one shining star that you should use if that's what you're after.
Exactly. It was very funny because I used to call MLIPAudit mean teacher. And then like people will train the models, and then it's like, no, we need to find a model to pass all the tests. When we were writing MLIPAudit, like we need to find a model that passed all the tests. And then we sit and we say like, well, we actually don't, right? It's better if we show that actually there's a long way to go, and that in all these applications, well, there's still work to do, right? And they don't do as great as we were expecting to do, because one thing is to say, yeah, we are solving quantum chemistry. Another thing is to actually have a pipeline that can run a physically accurate simulation, and that you can run maybe millions of them, so that you can then give that information to an experimentalist and have impact in a drug discovery process or materials for that case.
How do you see this sort of tension between sort of the needs of practitioners and these larger foundation models, and where do you think this is going to go?
So MLIPAudit can be a test also for these types of foundation models if they perform on all the tasks that they want to achieve. And it can be something people could follow to build a foundation model that builds on all different levels of theory. There are some models that were developed that actually follow this approach, that they even incorporate different levels of theory into their training data, and then have the model learn which level of theory was used for which kind of training data, which is also, of course, focused on which application it is, or it differentiates between types of materials, for example. And you could use MLIPAudit to test such a model on all the tasks and then evaluate the overall score. But I don't think there must be this need for if you just look at the applications. You could just see, okay, what do I want my model to be able to do? And then train a model that is able to do this. Because a foundation model may be, for example, super, super large and it maybe is the most accurate, but then maybe you need something that's reliable and fast.
Yeah.
And at least in my opinion, it doesn't have to be the same model. It could be two models.
So from an applications point of view, where do you see a use case for these big models, or would you say, oh, I'd rather not follow this trend and go a separate way?
I think there can be a use case if you really want your model to be able to have learned all of physics, and you say, okay, no matter what problem I throw at this, it needs to be able to solve that. But I think I go a bit against this trend and would say, okay, what I care about is if it can do what I want it to be able to do. And
right.
Then for other things, there may be other models. In physics, it's the same, right? It's of course, it doesn't need to be as complicated as choosing a functional in DFT. I would wish for this not to be the case. And I'm very hopeful that the MLIPs are actually doing a great job in making things a lot easier. But I think it's okay if you choose your model for your application.
Really interesting. And kind of aside from this holy grail of a foundation model, what else would you say is in store? What kind of should future directions look like, and how does that all hang together with MLIPAudit?
Mm-hmm. So we need to deploy this model, right? Like the molecular modeling community. So some people have devoted their careers to make classical force fields, parameters for running simulations with all sorts of materials or biomolecules. But there is a huge community doing enhanced sampling, like deploying tools, doing simulations, like how do we extract free energies, how do we do pipelines in which you can extract, for example, reactivity parameters, etc., how you can build pipelines end to end. And then in terms of foundational models, it's also a matter of you can learn everything, and then can you distill this information into a smaller model that you can actually deploy. And then I think there is also a lot of room to improve how to train these models and which features, embeddings, etc., and what is really encoded inside the model, in the layers of the model, what it is learning, how it is learning. It is learning many body expansions. It's really learning physics. It's just extrapolating some numbers. It's going to become more and more interesting. But I think to move the needle, especially in biomolecular simulations, we have a bottleneck there that it's, I believe, purely engineering at the moment to be able to actually run meaningful times, right? Like when I talk to people, say that I can run 100 picosecond, and it's like, well, protein folding happens in millisecond scale. So chop, like we have a long way to go here, or we need to become smarter and do it in a different way. So I think it's quite a lot of work to do and quite fascinating.
Brilliant. That was a super interesting discussion. Thank you both so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was really fun.
Thanks, it was great.
And to any listeners who would be interested in trialing MLIPAudit and maybe auditing their own models, MLIPAudit is available as a PyPy package, so very easy to install, but we'll also link the open source code below, as well as the paper.
And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in this episode. Make sure to come by next month when we will be talking about protein design in practice.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.